Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this teleconference. The theme of the most recent issue of the Rosicrucian Digest is Mystics and Visionaries. This is posted at rosicrucian.org/Rosicrucian-digest, so you can find this issue of the magazine online. We included 12 articles on some women and men throughout history who forged a unique path through life with mystical principles. Today, we're going to explore the lives and inspiration of four of these remarkable individuals. First, Michael Shaluli is going to speak about Rumi, who lived from 1207 to 1273. Then Sherry Gandy will speak about Hildegard of Bingen, who lived from the year 1098 to 1179. Marion Owens will speak about Jakob Boehme, who lived from 1575 to 1624. And Joshua Norman will speak about Harriet Tubman, who lived from 1822 to 1913. When we chose the people to include in this issue, we decided not to include anyone who is alive today or anyone who started a religion. We focused on women and men from around the world who came from various backgrounds, some privileged, some greatly challenged, and through their mystical life, greatly inspired others. We'll now start with Michael Shaluli and Rumi. Mike, thank you so much for being here today. Would you please tell us a little about Rumi and the world in which he lived?
Sure. And thank you, Grandmaster Julie. It's always a pleasure to be here sharing, and it's always a pleasure to talk about Rumi. As mentioned earlier, he was born in 1207. It was actually in an area of Afghanistan, but that was part of the Persian Empire at that time. And it was in the days of Genghis Khan. So when Rumi was very young, his father took him and the family in a caravan and they moved 2,000 miles and ended up in Turkey, what is current day Turkey. So it was a very difficult time back then. Life was probably far more harsh than it is today, but that was the world in which he lived in. He and his family shared a tight bond. His father was a Sufi mystic, a jurist, head of a madrasa, which was like a spiritual community, and so certainly this all had a profound impact on him, and he lived in the joy of life, even in the difficult times that he found himself in.
What inspires you most about Rumi's life?
I would say that he lived in the time period that he did, when, as mentioned, the times were it was a harsh time in life. And the surroundings were not necessarily inspirational. And yet he was able to live that mystical life and to bring out such beauty, not only in his poetry, but in his surroundings. He took after his father later in life and was also a great Sufi mystic himself. And he was well respected and honored in his day. And of course, he gave us that beautiful poetry, again, coming from those difficult times. So it really inspires me that he found that place to go within and to bring out all that beauty that we still enjoy to this day.
What initiated Rumi's life as a mystic or visionary?
Well, he was born into a spiritual family. Certainly that had a profound effect. They ran a madrasa, which was like a spiritual community at that time. And during his childhood, he was naturally drawn towards mystical pursuits. He expressed mystical inclinations from a very early age. And poets had, older poets at the time saw this in him and began to work with him in his writings. And he studied legal issues. He became a jurist and was very involved in his Sufi background. So he was a mystic, a writer, and uh, he continued that his whole life.
What's something you feel most people don't know about Rumi?
Perhaps, probably that in some parts of the Persian speaking world, his writings are studied second only to the Quran. In the Persian world, he's to this day quite well respected. And it was a surprise to me as I began to study Rumi that he's credited with the concept of the practice of whirling to commune with God. I didn't know that that was related to him, but of course, the whirling dervishes and other traditions came out of that, something that he more or less started.
Your article refers to a book by Melody Motzi, who wrote, quote, Rumi's classical Persian verse isn't meant to be read while sitting, but rather sung while spinning. For this is how Rumi composed his mystical poetry, whirling and rhyming,
Yeah,
end quote. And that really struck me and changed the way I read his works. I hadn't imagined that.
yeah, it's hard to imagine. And he must have had scribes that were scribing, as he would express himself through this motion and the dancing. They must have been taking down the information. It's amazing, really, when you think about it.
Yeah, after I read your article, I chose one of my favorite Rumi sayings, and I didn't purposely dance to it, but I stood in a way that I could be moved, and it felt so different. Here's the one that I chose that he wrote, if the divine said, Rumi, pay homage to everyone that has helped you enter my arms, there would not be one experience of my life, not one thought, not one feeling, not any act I would not bow to.
Yeah, beautiful.
It just was, it is just so moving.
And it's moving with very few words. He has so many profound quotes. And now with social media, it's kind of wonderful because there's lots of Rumi pages and you can find various very small quotes that mean so much. And it's amazing that he was able to capture that in the way that he did.
Are there any sayings by Rumi that you'd like to share that you particularly like?
It is hard to pick out any one favorite, but here are a few. There is a voice that doesn't use words. Listen. Everything that is made beautiful and fair and lovely is made for the eye of one who sees. Let yourself be drawn by the stronger pull of that which you truly love. Don't you know yet? It is your light that lights the worlds. Respond to every call that excites your spirit. Joy. One day will come when I shall fly to my beloved. And if I were to choose a favorite, it would be this one. What you seek is also seeking you. I love going to the monographs. The monographs show us that he was actually really involved as a Sufi mystic, and that I think I'm trying to remember the name of a sect. It was a sect of religious people that had a profound effect upon Muhammad and the Muslim religion. And he's related to that sect. But the name of that sect is escaping me right now. But the fact that he was influenced by that group showed us that he saw the spiritual work within that sect, the Sufi sect of the Muslim religion.
If you could ask Rumi one question, what would it be?
It would probably be, how did you keep the mystical and spiritual life alive within you so profoundly in all that you would do in life? And it was not only in his writings or his whirling, but also in his frequent work within society. He didn't shy away from correcting difficult situations, yet he kept his poetic relationship with life and with all things in everything that he did. And an example of that, after he passed, one of his sons found many of his notes. And as a jurist and someone who helped take care of conflicts in the madrasa, he would often have to do legal things and talking to people about conflict resolution. But in his notes, he always had poetic verses, even next to some of the legal writings, and he used the poetic side of him, the mystical part of him, to help with those conflict resolutions. And I thought that was very beautiful. He found a way to make the mystical a part of his life, even when it was a difficult part of life.
Yeah, that is beautiful.
Yeah.
At the end of your article, you wrote, quote, "It was Rumi's desire, and it is the desire of every inspiring mystic, to follow divine inspiration to a holy place inside, and then to bring that inspiration out into this world. Rumi did this through his translations of his beloved into his writings, his whirling, and through his teaching of others. In the spirit of Rumi, may we remember to pause our world and patiently listen for the beloved to speak in the vibrations animate in matter and all around us. As you capture your whispers from your own connection to the beloved, perhaps you might compose what you experience into some outer form to inspire those around you. May the essence of Rumi ever inspire your search for the beloved in you, which, as Rumi says, is also seeking you."
Yeah.
End quote. Thank you for this wish to each of us.
Thank you, Grandmaster Julie. And it was truly a pleasure researching Rumi and presenting that to everyone.
Thank you. And can you recommend a reliable resource or two to learn more about Rumi?
Yes, I have a few. There was actually, it's a novel that I really enjoyed. It's a historical novel. It uses historical facts, but it's a novel. And it's called The 40 Rules of Love by Alif Shafak. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Then there's also the Masnavi of Rumi, and it was translated by someone named Alan Williams into English. So it's book one, two, and three of the Masnavi of Rumi, which I would recommend. And finally, a website, and I'll just kind of spell it out, dar-al-masnavi.org. And you can find lots of nice links at that site relating to Rumi and his works. And finally, you mentioned the Rumi Prescription by Melody Moise. Also a very good book about his life.
Well, thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Next, we have Sherry Gandy and Hildegard of Bingen. Sherry, tell us a little about Hildegard and the world in which she lived.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So, Hildegard was born in 1098 in what we now call Germany in the Rhineland. And she was actually born to an aristocratic family. They were very high up in the German nobility. And she was the 10th child. And so, as the 10th child, she was actually tithed to the church. And so she was set to live her life as an anchoress, which means she was going to be walled up next to the church. And the anchorites and the anchoresses, they had a little hole where they would, give them food and then they could pass their trash back out. And so that was supposed to be her life. And it turned out that she was destined for things much bigger than that. And so, some interesting things about the time in which she lived was so this was the 12th century. Some of you may have heard of the 12th century Renaissance. So this was a time when a lot of the lost information that had been produced by the Greeks and had been really saved by many of the Arabic scholars had started to make its way back into parts of Europe. And so scholars were starting to retranslate like Aristotle, who hadn't been in circulation for hundreds of years, back into Latin so people could understand it. This was also the time of the Crusades. So the first crusade was fought very close to her birth, and then the second crusade was significantly later, about 50 years later, when she was in her 40s. And so it's really fascinating how all these different things happened. Like that's when the Grail legends started, and also the university schools and all kinds of interesting, great things that really set us up for the modern world today.
What inspires you most about Hildegard's life?
Yeah, a few things. I think one of the main things was that yes, she was from an aristocratic family, but she still had a number of limitations because she didn't feel that she was really educated, even though she learned a little bit of Latin and some of the scripture when she was as a nun growing up. But one of the most intriguing things was that it was her relationship to her divine revelations and what she saw. She really trusted her interior and her divine mysticism, and she really just went with like the instructions that she was given, right? So even though she was told to do really difficult things, she just kept following instructions. And so much of her creativity and everything that she did, all of her compositions, like books and all the relationships that she had throughout her life, they were the result of so many of the instructions, the divine instructions that she was given, and just how she followed those for everything that she accomplished.
What initiated Hildegard's life as a mystic or visionary?
Yeah, this was really interesting to me because she was actually um, known for her like prophecies when she was a child, even before she was given to the church. And so she didn't really tell anybody about these visions that she had, but in her years at the monastery, she ended up talking to her what became her secretary, like her priest, and then the woman that was there with her and her teacher, and she would tell them a little bit about the visions, and they were like, just keep going, keep going. This is a gift. But she didn't say anything publicly. And then when she was 42, she had a vision and she was told to write and tell the world what she saw and what she heard. And so she had to get permission from the leaders of the monastery in order to be able to do this. So she managed to do that. And then she started writing her books, and the nuns in the nunnery started helping produce illuminations. And eventually she wrote Bernard of Clairvaux, a very famous churchman of the day, and she got him to, well, she didn't get him to, but she was so persuasive with her story and her about her visions that he really promoted her with the Pope. And so after the Pope said, "Oh my goodness, your genius cannot be held back," then she became a local celebrity and she was off to the races. But that didn't happen until she was 42.
Although she had these visions when she was a child.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Kept it all in.
Yeah. What is something you feel most people don't know about Hildegard?
Yeah, I think her ideas about the feminine aspect of creation, so much of what's in her books is about different aspects of the feminine and how the feminine nurtures the earth and nurtures humanity and cares for humanity. And she created this whole term that she uses to represent this feminine aspect of creativity called viriditas. And that's like the beautiful green lushness of the earth. And she talked about how the feminine surrounds creation with this ring of fire, and it's this fiery love that allows humanity and creation to continue going. And yeah, and she's, obviously one of the only people that had a deeply feminine idea about the world of creation. And she even rewrote the creation story in Genesis to say, oh, it was not Eve's fault, it was Adam's fault. Right. And she still got away with that, right? And so she just kept on writing. And I think that's one thing that probably a lot of people don't know about.
Thank you. If you could ask Hildegard one question, what would it be?
I think I would ask her about technology today because she stressed so much about the femininity and the divine feminine aspect of creativity. I think I would ask her about what the role of the divine feminine could be today when we're in a world with so much technology and some people would say that humanity might be misusing its ability to create and and to get her perspective on that I think would be really interesting.
Thank you. Your
Sure.
article refers to theologian Barbara Newman's book that lists some of Hildegard's firsts and onlys. And I'm gonna list these. This is from your article. The only woman of her age accepted as an authoritative voice on Christian doctrine. The first woman who received express papal permission to write theological books. The only medieval woman who preached openly. So in that entire world, just one woman was allowed to preach openly before mixed audiences of clergy and laity with full approval of the church authorities. She was the author of the first known morality play and the only 12th century playwright who is not anonymous. She's the only composer of her era, not to mention the only medieval woman known both by name and by a large corpus of surviving music, and the first scientific writer to discuss sexuality and gynecology from a female perspective. It's just so amazing when you think you started by telling us that as the 10th child in her family, she was donated or given to the Roman Catholic Church, a decision she wasn't involved in any way. For years, lived in a tiny cell, as you said, had a little place to bring food in, had just, I'm just trying to imagine how it's really impossible to imagine how someone could go from those conditions to achieving so much.
Yes, it's yeah, almost unimaginable. And that's why I think that she's such an interesting mystic because it was her visions, right? And when she was able to get permission from the Pope and from Bernard to keep on writing, that was essentially, she had a pass for the rest of her life, right? And she used it very well. I mean, she wrote letters. She was a prolific letter writer to people, from lay people to, celebrities like I won't say celebrities, but royalty like Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Frederick Barbarossa brought her to court to help him figure out what to do about his future. I mean, and then there's stories about how when she was on her preaching tours going down the Rhine, people would wave to her from the shore, and so. Yeah, she was very much led by the divine, and I think that's one of the main themes. Keep following the divine call, and you'll find what you're supposed to do.
Well, you said that earlier that she uh, um, accepted or embraced is the word I'm looking for. Embraced that if she received what you called instructions, which I think is hearing the voice of the divine, that she would proceed no matter what. That's what I understood you to say.
Yeah, exactly. And so it wasn't without fear, though, because she does write about how she was afraid to go ahead, but she did have the support of a lot of people. And so she had her secretary Volmar, who would transcribe things into better Latin. She had other people, she had her nuns that would help her do all the illuminations. I mean, she had the political support, right, of the popes. I mean, so she had a whole cadre of people, even though she proceeded in fear, and she all her life she said, I am not educated. And that was really one of the things that gave her more credibility, because for the, rest of the church clergy, they probably wouldn't believe what a woman said, but Hildegard's reputation and her vetting, as such by the papal authority, well, what she says, it's true. So so that really like helped her in a way, which is, kind of ironic. So, but yeah, it's an amazing story.
So her humility helped her.
Absolutely. Yeah. She was
Yeah.
very humble, very humble. And I thought that was also one interesting thing when the Pope, I think it was Pope Benedict, when he made her a doctor of the church, and when he canonized her officially, that he called out specifically her humility.
Mhm.
And I thought that was really special about her humility.
Thank you. What
Yeah.
are a few reliable resources you recommend to learn more about Hildegard?
Yeah, you mentioned the Barbara Newman book. One of her books is called Sister of Wisdom, and she's great. She talks so much about detail and in detail about Hildegard's life. And then there's another book full of it's like a deep dive into all the images, and the images are reproduced in color, and there are two volumes. It's by Sarah Salvadori, and it's called Journey into the Images, and it's phenomenal. I'm pretty sure she had to get permission from the Eibingen monastery, Hildegard's monastery that's still going, because they own all the copyright to those color images. But it's beautiful, and she goes into depth into the meaning as well. So it's a little bit more accessible than some of Hildegard's direct writings, because the reproductions in those books are black and white, and they're harder to see into.
And when you talk about the images, you're talking about images that were created at eh, w- at the time of Hildegard's life. She had these visions, and someone created these images right then that depicted the visions that she had.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she would get in fact, the picture that you showed for the introduction a few slides
Hmm.
ago shows her representing like this living light that she called, and she would have a vision right in front of her, and so she would be able to see it. And she said this like living light sensation, it was just like being encased by love. It wasn't heat, but it was like this, intense love feeling. And so she would see things, and a lot of the different, like her whole theology about the feminine aspect of creativity and creation, everything was given to her through her visions. And so, unlike some other mystics of the time, she didn't go into like an ecstasy or anything like that. I mean, she literally saw something right in front of her. And yeah, so her nuns, again, she had a big crew of people to help her bring those to life. And so she created a number of books, and those color images are from those books.
Hmm. Well, Sherry, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, we have Marion Owens and Jakob Boehme.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Well, Marian, thank you so much. Tell us a little bit about Jakob Boehme and the world in which he lived.
Well, Jakob Boehme was born in 1575 in a town of Görlitz, which is near the Polish border, and in Saxony, one of the states of Germany, near the Neisse River. Um, Jakob was born, he was the fourth son of a rather prosperous farmer. His father was also named Jakob, and but Jakob was considered to be too weak for farming. So his father said, "Well, you can't farm, so I'll get you somewhere to make something of your life," and send him to learn shoemaking. And so they bought a shoe bank in Görlitz, and Jacob did that. And then once a stranger came that had ordered shoes and said to Jacob, someday you will be a big person. People will take notice of you, and never paid for the shoes. But anyway, as years went on, um, Jacob he was wandering in nature, and of course, raised a Lutheran and very much embedded in the thinking of the devil, hell, angels. And I think that's something that Jacob was questioning. And so during that era, also 50 years before, Paracelsus was born, and there were many, many followers of Paracelsus in that town they thought that should be a spiritual renewal, and it was obtainable without going to a walled church or books. And I think that at that time there was a lot of influx of thinking how to um, have people advance the thinking of humanity, become more spiritual, become better people. Because I find during that time, we have Kepler was born, Valentin Andrea was born. The Fama of Rosicrucian writing, The Chemical Wedding, was printed in Strasbourg, 1616 in Austria, which is during the life of Jakob Boehme. And then even before that, we have Christian Rosenkreuz came into existence with those dates of 1378 or 1484, then which is within Burmese 150-year existence. Then Nicolaus Copernicus was born, and so on. Francis Bacon was later on. So it's that time when I think when the thinking was of spirituality, and Jacob was going into nature and just picking up a clump of dirt and wondering, how did the Creator make this? How was this created? And it is stated that Jacob picked up a dish, and there was a bright light that struck that dish, and he said, all of a sudden, it was like a lightning bolt, was like in a thunderstorm. He said everything was opened up to him. He said he climbed the Jacob's ladder, and within 15 minutes, he says, eine Viertelstunde, 15 minutes. And I read it several times. He was able to see what they call the Ungrund, which is actually before the beginning of God, the Creator, the divine being, which is like a monad. He was able to see how the world was created, the triune nature of everything. He was able to see the being of all beings. And he said, I didn't know what was happening to me. I just didn't know. And so he was writing down, later on, he was writing down everything that he remembered, and then things were coming to him. Spiritual knowledge was coming to him. He was like an automatic writing. He said, I didn't understand what I was writing, but I wrote it anyway, because I guess he figured that later on he would review it, maybe meditate on it, contemplate it. And so he wrote the Aurora, which was the first one. And he obviously shared some of it with the church elders. And of course, that was a no-go. And so they thought that he was writing and telling poisonous and giving poisonous thoughts to the people in town. And Jacob would sit in church and they would point at him and say, you did this and how bad he was. And so he didn't write for 5 years. I believe he might have, maybe he had a moment of, well, it's hard to explain because I would have asked him that. Why did you not do that? But he was threatened with not being able to write for years. He had his house stoned. He had 4 children, and his family was threatened, and he was threatened with thrown in jail. So, but anyway, he did write and continued to write, and some very well-known nobles of in that area became aware of him and wanted to know more about him, and they took the writings in grains of sacks of grain, and they smuggled them out to these various people, which was, I thought that was very, very interesting to smuggle them out. So, but the Aurora, the first writing, um, it was confiscated and never finished. And then later on, he found that copies had been made, and he came without his approval, and he came face to face with a copy of one of those writings, his Aurora, and which is I was just astounded that people would have the nerve to do that. So anyway, that was kind of the area. The town itself was actually quite well to do. It was a hub for trade. It was a center in Europe for trade. And later on, Jacob himself was a merchant in textiles, and he traveled with his wife for selling textiles and yarn. And so the only other thing I wanted to mention was that his Aurora had to have a responsibility statement, which meant he had to say that those writings were not his own thinking, but they were inspired by the Creator through his soul. So otherwise, I think he might have been in trouble and been prosecuted.
Wow. So, what inspires you most about his life?
What inspired me was that no matter what, even at the threat of being incarcerated or killed, he continued. He believed in it so strongly, no matter what, he wasn't going to give up. He stood himself up and he said, I'm going to write anyway. So we'll just smuggle this stuff out and people will get it, because he thought that that was something that humanity should know. It was for the betterment of everyone, and he considered everyone to be his brother and sister. And he didn't understand why he wished that they would be understanding what he was writing. So it was at that time, I think he was being, I don't know, I think he was being put back, kept at bay, don't write anymore, but he did anyways, and the writings did get out.
You mentioned a few ways that he was initiated as a mystic and visionary. One is just the philosophy of the time that he's looking at soil, and what a thought-provoking question, like, where did this soil come from? And just the whole atmosphere of that he was living in. Also that he looks at this dish and boom, the whole structure of the universe is revealed to him.
15 minutes.
Wow.
And so it's almost unbelievable, but I guess historically it did occur. And then he kept writing, writing, writing. And he states that he didn't even understand what he was writing. He just wrote. And he wrote long sentences, and he was very repetitive in his writings. And he wrote long sentences, so it would probably take 25 words to describe one little thought, because his education was very little. He had just basic education, and he said that I've learned more in those 15 minutes than I would ever learn being in a university. And it was sometimes I would feel him saying, well, you know nothing, but I know it all came to me. I can see him pointing his little finger and trying to tune in to his thinking. Why did you do this? But a very interesting personality, and
Yeah.
obviously very important to the future thinkers also, because there were many thinkers who followed his teachings.
Yeah. And you're very involved with the traditional Martinist order, so you know that Louis Claude de Saint-Martin was very inspired by Jakob Boehme, who lived way before he lived and considered him his second teacher.
Well, Saint-Martin had to learn German in order to understand it. And so, I mean, Boehme was mentioned. The names of Boehme were familiar to many Rosicrucians. It was, well, the French, he translated, Saint-Martin translated his writings into French. And then Isaac Newton was aware of the teachings, and even Tsar Alexander in Russia valued Burmese teachings so much, and they were creating a new religious awakening within Russia, which is very interesting. So then we also have mention of Burmese in Carl Jung, his writings. Hegel was one of the German thinkers. So it just he influenced so much that I don't think he really realized at the time that how much he influenced even today. So
Yeah. What is something you feel most people don't know about Jakob Boehme?
well, he didn't just sit down. Oh, he was a mystic and studied. He didn't really study anything. That's the interesting thing. He didn't sit down in any book. He read nothing in any books, and he denies books. He doesn't believe in the books. He says, "I'm not educated." And I think he scoffed at education and all the people who said, "Well, what do you know? You're really not educated." And he scoffed at those people. He said, "Well, you know nothing. This all came to me from the divine." And so I think that that's probably one of the things that really is inspirational to me that searching, if you search within, it's like he did. He searched and searched and searched, and he prayed to the divine and prayed to the divine. And finally, he said, with the divine mercy, the gate was opened, finally, where I could see everything. And isn't that every wish of every mystic to just open the gate and please let us see everything that we wish to know? We're all seekers. It's just fascinating that I just want to go more and more and more and more into the historical things and things. And even though he was a merchant, and I figure that he's a merchant of textiles, so did he bargain with the merchants and how much is this going to be and that going to be? And did he, quarrel with them? And here he is writing this wonderful mystical the writings, which some of them I don't even understand, although the Rosicrucian Library has about a dozen of Burmese writings.
Mhm.
The sämtliche Schriften, Jakob Boehme. It's all in German, in Baroque German. And so that's where I've been getting a lot of mine. And of course, there is this little booklet. It's it's a little pocket book. And one day when I was much younger in the order, uh, Grandmaster Bob Daniels, I had come to see him about something, I think about Martinism. And he gave me this book and he said, "Soror, if you can, please translate some part of this book for me and let me know because the translations sometimes can be difficult. One
Mhm.
has to be almost a mystic to understand some of these early writings." And so I did, and it was like, well, he's talking to me and telling me, "Soror, it's time. Translate some of these parts." So I sat down. It took me about 6 months to get into this Baroque German. It would have been easier if my mother had been alive, so she could have helped me. But I struggled through it and it came together with what I think that Grandmaster Daniels would appreciate at that time. And I still have the book, and this will be sent to Grand Lodge. I'll be sending it to the Grand Lodge because you can order it. You can order the booklets on Amazon and Walmart, and they're in German. So I have to
Ah,
learn German. I don't know of any good English translations. I'm
yeah.
sorry that I can't share that. I don't know of any good ones.
If you could ask Jakob Boehme one question, what would it be?
Well, if I could ask him one question, I would ask him when he saw the rewritten copy of his Aurora, um, what did he think about it? Did he see any changes? Did he see somebody crossing out sentences or say lie, 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 or untrue, untrue? Did a Lutheran preacher look at it and deny everything in it? I was just curious. What did you think? What did you think about it? And what did you do with the book when you got it? And of course, you can't sue anybody in court. There was no court to sue. And so did he think that was an identical copy and still contained his responsibility statement? that would have been my curiosity. What would you do if you saw that? Someone copied you, stole
Hmm.
it from you, basically.
Yeah. Is there anything else you would like to share?
Well, it's just that he lived in an unusual time, and I wanted to mention during the time that he lived, he died in 1624, but in 1604, there was a huge event that happened over in Europe, and that was the explosion of the supernova. People thought this was a comet, and actually, Kepler was the one who studied and followed it. In fact, that was seen for 3 weeks over that area where Bumi lived. And people were thinking doomsday and the Earth is coming to an end. And I think Kepler discovered that it was a white star's explosion in the Milky Way. In fact, it can still be seen today, remnants of it from Kepler. So, and he wrote a book about it called De Stella Nova, but it was thought to be a comet, and I thought that was an interesting thing. And then all the other things coming to fore in the century, all these other individuals, discoverers and thinkers at the time, within 150 years. Martin Luther, he had his 97 or 92 thesis that he nailed against the church in Wittenberg. He was born, that was happening 50 years before Jakob Boehme was born. So there was a lot of probably anti-church thinking at that time, I must say. And it's obvious because Boehme had problems with the Lutherans, and in fact, he went to Prague to be. They had to investigate him further, and even the highly evolved Lutherans at that said, "No, we can't. We can't do anything. We can't throw him in jail." And I think they agreed with him. That this high thinker. So he was never, but he did face damage to his house and threats. And it's difficult when you believe in it so strongly that even he says in his own writings, even at his life's risk, he was writing this. That's
Mhm.
pretty steadfast in their feeling and their thinking. So I just, it's fascinating. He's it's not just a cobbler making shoes.
All
Although I
right.
could see how that frustrates him because they probably never fit somebody and then you have to do it over. So I don't know. Maybe you thought I'll give that up. I'll sell textiles because that's what everybody else did in town. But even now, I mentioned earlier, I was reading, it was called Girly Wood because there's so many movies made. It's such a picturesque Renaissance era type of town. So many buildings are still standing. But that was an interesting thing. But
Yeah, in
anyway,
Görlitz.
it's
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's actually a real hubbub for tourism
Mm.
in Silesia. Yeah.
Hmm. What are a few reliable resources you would recommend to learn more about Jakob Boehme?
Well, I looked, and I do say that the Rosicrucian Research Library has got a huge volume, all kinds of volumes on Jakob Boehme, and I did actually order one from Amazon. It was hardbound in German. It's the old German language. So, and then on Google, if you go into Google, you can Google some of the archival books and historical editions that one might be able to find.
Yeah.
So anyway, that would be what I'd like to share with that. I don't know of any English translations. The English translations sometimes are very difficult. Someone was in order for a foreign language to be translated, one would have to be along those lines of thinking. Because I did have a soror once that had read English translations of Jakob Boehme, and she said she couldn't understand anything in there. Well, and I think that might have some truism because um, sometimes there is something lost in the translation,
Hmm.
and you don't get the feeling, but then I have not read any English versions of Jakob Boehme because I have the German. I'm fortunate enough to still speak it and understand it, uh, even though my German was basic, low, up to sixth grade. So how much do you learn by then? But I still was able to read his Baroque because it has letters that you can't even find in modern times. Where an S looks like an H and an N looks like an A.
Right.
So anyway, that was pretty much. I could go on for a long time about Jakob Boehme, but
Well, Marion, thanks so much for sharing your
okay.
passion and really
That was
giving
my
us a
passion.
feel for him. Thank you so much.
I did want, if you don't mind, I want to share one sentence because Jacob, he drew a lily after he was inspired. He drew a lily and he says, "A lily blooms over every mountain and valley to the end of the earth. He who seeks will find." Amen. So that's he who seeks will find. Anyway,
So
thank you
beautiful.
for the opportunity and
Thank you, Marion.
thank you too. Thank you too.
All right. Next, we'll speak with Joshua Norman about Harriet Tubman.
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, Josh, thanks so much. Tell us a little about Harriet Tubman and the world in which she lived.
Well, Harriet Tubman was born around 1822. They're not sure, but guess that it's about 1822, into slavery near the Chesapeake Bay in Dorchester County, Maryland, where she endured harsh labor and violence from an early age. As a teenager, Tubman was struck in the head and nearly killed by a heavy metal ball during an altercation with a slave overseer. The incident led to a lifetime of headaches, seizures, and narcolepsy, but it had the opposite effect of slowing her down. Instead, the incident contributed to an intensification of her visions and dreams, opening up what she interpreted as a direct channel of communication with the divine that she relied on for the rest of her life. As an adult, Tubman firmly rejected the Christianity of slave owners that demanded subservience to some distant deity. Instead, her Christianity was far more mystical, that focused on direct communication with the divine, and she was inspired by stories of deliverance from the Old Testament. She said often that the divine spoke to her directly through her dreams and visions, and warning her of danger and directing her path. In 1849, when she was in her late 20s, she escaped to freedom in Pennsylvania. And rather than remaining safe, she returned to the South approximately 13 times in the next 11 years, guiding around 70 enslaved people to freedom through the Underground Railroad. She is said to have not lost a single person during her rescue missions. And she personally credited her success not only to careful planning and a deep knowledge of the natural world, but also to her unwavering conviction that the divine was directly leading and protecting her. Later, during the Civil War, Tubman served the Union in various important roles, including sometimes behind enemy lines. And after the war, she devoted her life to humanitarian work, advocating for formerly enslaved people, for the poor, for the elderly, and she was a suffragette as well.
Josh, what inspires you most about Harriet Tubman's life?
Well, as far as I can tell, her story has no other historical equivalent. In all of recorded human history, there are really no other examples of an enslaved person escaping and then repeatedly returning to danger to help others as often as she did. She was barely 5 feet tall, but the things that she accomplished are completely outsized for any era, let alone the one she lived in. Even if you take out the fact that she was born enslaved and was never given a formal education, her story is still incredible. I mean, Tubman's bravery in returning to the South 13 times, it's hard to imagine because if she'd been captured, she would have been instantly put to death. Tubman is without a doubt one of history's most remarkable examples of a person who took their profound spiritual faith and shaped a life of extraordinary courage out of it.
What initiated her life as a mystic or visionary?
It's hard to say when exactly it began, but by the time Tubman was born, there had been a long tradition in African American communities of visions and dreams that were interpreted as direct channels of communication with the divine. In fact, some scholars believe that this tradition has roots in West Africa, which is where most of America's slaves, including at least some of Tubman's ancestors, came from. For many African Americans of that era, the divine was something personal inside each person that was not impossible to get in touch with. and it was not an impersonal being high in the sky and out of touch who you couldn't connect with. That said, while Tubman's visions and mystical beliefs could be in part described as a product of her community and era, she was one of the very few who leaned on her mysticism in order to commit extreme acts of bravery.
What's something you feel most people don't know about Harriet Tubman?
Well, there's two things. First, Tubman is the first woman in American history to have led a military operation. She successfully led the Combahee ferry raid in South Carolina that freed 756 enslaved people and destroyed valuable Confederate supplies. She personally guided Union gunboats past Confederate sea mines based on intelligence she had gathered. And it is said that not a single Union soldier lost their life in the raid. The second thing is she's best known as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but by the end of her life, she had worn dozens of hats. She was a military scout, an intelligence operative, a raid leader, a teacher of freed people, a nurse, a cook, a humanitarian, a suffragist, and at the end of her life, she founded a group home for elderly African Americans.
If you could ask Harriet Tubman one question, what would it be?
I would love to know more about her knowledge of the natural world and how that helped her. There were so many different aspects of it that she relied upon to succeed in her daring rescues and in her work on the Underground Railroad. For example, she said the North Star frequently helped guide her at night when they couldn't light themselves or light the way in front of us. They relied on the North Star. She's also said to have had a really excellent ear for mimicking animal noises, which would help her fool potential captors and signal to other members on the Underground Railroad that it was safe. And she also had a deep knowledge of which wild plants were safe to eat along the Underground Railroad, which was crucial to her success. I'd like to know more about how she learned all these things and how the natural world actually helped her.
You entitled your article, "The Mysticism of Harriet Tubman Made the Impossible Possible." And to me, that perfectly describes what Harriet Tubman did. She made the impossible possible. You wrote that her first biographer, Sarah Bradford, who lived in her life, in her 1886 book, Harriet, the Moses of Her People, wrote about Harriet's spirituality. Quote, "She seemed ever to feel the divine presence near, and she talked with God, the divine, as a person talks to their friend." You wrote she believed she got direct help from the divine. And you solved a mystery for me. I have wondered how anyone could possibly have been so brave to escape enslavement and return 13 times to save others, as you said, probably around 70 other people. And she had to have known that had she been caught, the consequences would have been horrific. Yet she still returned 13 times. Thank you so much for sharing such deep a deep experience really of how important, how essential spirituality and her connection with the divine were.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's very fascinating that it really helped her accomplish all these unbelievable things in her lifetime.
Is there anything else you'd like to share about Harriet Tubman?
Well, there's a little bit of a follow-up on the head injury that I thought was really interesting. In the late 1890s, when she was in her 70s, she finally got fed up with the pain and the buzzing in her head. So she asked a doctor in Boston to operate on it, and the surgery was successful and it helped her feel more comfortable. But here's the thing, she insisted on doing it without any anesthesia. Instead, she is said to have bitten down on a bullet like the Civil War soldiers she witnessed getting amputations. And to me, that just adds to the idea that this woman was a superhero. I mean, she was beyond explanation in some of the things that she accomplished.
Yes, no question. What are a few reliable resources you recommend to learn more about Harriet Tubman?
Oh, there's a lot of great stuff out there about her. A lot of people recommend a 2004 biography called Bound for the Promised Land. It's by Kate Clifford Larson. It's a very comprehensive book, and it relies very heavily on primary sources for information. Another great book, including one that I read for the article, came out in 2024. It's called Night Flyer, Harriet Tubman and the Faith Dreams of a Free People. It's by Tia Miles. And the book basically asks, what did Tubman's spiritual world that fostered such bravery look like from the inside? And then finally, if you just Google Harriet Tubman, Library of Congress, the first search result should be a page with many excellent and reliable links to information about her.
Thank you. Josh, you ended your article with the following. Through the lens of her biographers, we see a woman who lived at the intersection of the visible and invisible worlds. Her faith was not abstract belief, but lived experience, guiding her through danger and uncertainty. Tubman stands as a reminder that mysticism is not always quiet or withdrawn. In her case, it was practical and transformative. It enabled her to navigate perilous landscapes, inspire others, and ultimately reshape history. For Tubman, the mystical was not an escape from reality. It was a deeper engagement with it, a source of strength that made the impossible possible. Josh, thank you so much for being with us and for writing this beautiful article.
Thank you.
So Mike, Sherry, Marion, and Josh, thank you all so much for bringing these remarkable mystics and visionaries to life for us. This issue of the Rosicrucian Digest includes 12 articles of the extraordinary, inspiring lives of mystics and visionaries. The other individuals included are the oracles of Delphi in ancient Greece, Rabia of Basra in what is now Iraq, and her divine love in Sufi mysticism, the Christian mystic Francis of Assisi, Leonardo da Vinci, scientist, artist, and mystic, Mirabai, the Hindu mystic, and she is the beloved poet of India, Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, whose spiritual teachings form the foundation of the traditional Martinist order, Nicholas Roerich, an early member of the Rosicrucian order, a painter, a writer, archaeologist, and philosopher, and H. Spencer Lewis, the co-founder of the Rosicrucian order AMORC. And before we close, we're going to open the chat for all of you to list who you would include in your list of inspiring mystics and visionaries. So if you would please post in the chat, and I'm going to bring this up so I can share what you write. So who would you include as an inspiring mystic or visionary? Okay, Khalil Gibran, Shams, Helena Blavatsky, Martin Luther King, Plato, Carl Jung, Jakob Boehme, Noble Drew Ali, Louis Sullivan, Marie Corelli, Mary Magdalene, Jack Whitten, A.A. Teleferro, Paracelsus, Ben Franklin, Mary Magdalene again, William Walker Atkinson, Florence Nightingale, Manuel Swedenborg, Thomas Jefferson, Albert Einstein, Ralph Lewis, Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln, Miguel Ruiz, Goethe, Mary Magdalene several times here, Nicholas Copernicus, Francis Bacon, Johannes Kelpius. Well, thank you all so much for sharing. Thanks for being part of this teleconference. And again, to Mike, Sherry, Marion, and Josh, thank you for sharing these amazing mystics and visionaries with us.